Digby, just want to start off this show. This week has been rather difficult for me personally, but also for, in some part, I know members of this community and our audience who also listen to the Majority Report. And of course, many people who were close to him. Michael Brooks, a contributor and sometimes co-host and sometimes host on the Majority Report, also host of his own show, The Michael Brooks Show, and on Jacobin's Weekend Show, passed away this week, completely unexpectedly and suddenly on Monday. And it's obviously, as I think, people would imagine, to lose someone who is 36 years old is a huge shock. He meant a lot to thousands and thousands of people. I mean, I've been reading emails all week and getting messages on Twitter and just in a myriad of different places. And the stories of what Michael meant to people in terms of their political journeys, and also what he meant to colleagues and to people that he brought onto his show and gave wider exposure, was really stunning to read. And so I just wanted to mention to folks, if you are not familiar with Michael's work, I would encourage you to Google The Michael Brooks Show and go and watch many of the videos and the interviews he did. He had a particular focus on international relations and just internationalism. And it's fascinating stuff, very important to understand what's going on around the world, and in many respects, a lot of inspiration that can be taken from people's movement, workers' movements around the world, and the way that they have made positive change, or in some instances, not been able to make positive change. So I would encourage people to go check out Michael's work. I want to say rest in peace to him again, as I have many times, and rest in power as well this week. But we keep doing what we're doing, and hopefully we will make, at the very least, some small steps in a positive way in this country that he would have he obviously had been working and fighting for years and years. And so with that said, let's talk a little bit about what happened this week in the context of the news. And I know you've written a couple of pieces this week that in many respects sit tangentially, but are very relevant, or at least sit tangentially to two big stories that are really in the news this week. One is the ongoing coronavirus infections that are happening throughout the country. We're starting to hear people are starting to talk about, whether their kids are going to go back to school. I mean, it is, speaking as someone who has two kids, I can tell you it is a mess and a rolling tragedy in some respects, frankly. And we're also seeing in that same story, the coronavirus, the failure of our government to provide adequate relief to people and to cities and states, which in turn encourages these cities and states, some instances, to push and open up in a way that is far more aggressive than we can afford to do in the middle of a pandemic. And now, because they did that, because they lacked the funding, they didn't, they needed the sales tax in a lot of these states to make up the funding. Because that, of course, now people are having to go back inside. The economy is dipping again because the virus doesn't care if, there is no sales tax being collected and the U.S. government hasn't provided some type of living wage or living support for millions of workers, virus doesn't care. It's not going to go away just because people are sitting around pretending it's not there. And people are going to react in a rational way to that, which is, I don't want to get it because, even though it appears at this point, anyways, to not be as deadly as it was in those first weeks, maybe more so because we have better treatment and because of the cohort that it's infecting, because I think more vulnerable people are staying, are being that much more careful. But even with the death rate being lower, the implications of getting this can be horrific for years to come. And so you wrote a piece about Dr. Deborah Birx. Is her name Deborah? Yes. Okay. Tell folks, because she has been sort of a little bit, she's not been in the news in the way that Fauci has, but she's been there for a lot of this time. Who is she, and what happened that you caused you to write about her this week?
Well, it's interesting. I wrote, when she first came on board, I don't know if you remember the very first day when she was introduced, she came up and gave one of those Dear Leader speeches, kind of, it's just such a privilege to be with someone who is, so brilliant and has put together such a genius group of people, et cetera, et cetera. And it kind of creeped me out. I'm going, it was not a scientist speech, let's put it that way. It was a Dear Leader speech.
Right.
And I went back, so I went and looked at her, and I wrote a piece back in March about her and Dr. Redfield, the head of the CDC, because when I went and looked into it, I realized they're part of what has been described as a subculture around Mike Pence's office of evangelical Christians in the public health realm. Now, that may sound weirdly almost oxymoronic, but it isn't. There's a group of them, and Redfield and Birx are among them, who've been working in this field for decades, that are evangelical Christians, and they were focused on HIV around the world with a strong emphasis on abstinence-only education for people in Africa, et cetera, et cetera. Now, Birx is a real scientist. Well, Redfield is too. And Birx has, was part of this group, but apparently in the HIV realm, she was not solely pushing abstinence only for girls. This was their emphasis, but she was, in that crowd, and my antenna went up with that. I'm going, okay, so what is this? A public health subculture of evangelical Christians who are anti, who were pushing abstinence only, and what is this? But apparently this existed, and Birx is part of it, and although she had a lot of, she was widely respected by people in the field, et cetera, et cetera. It occurred to me that there was another dimension to her and Redfield that we needed to pay attention to. Well, as this pandemic has unfolded, she used to show up at all the briefings that they were allowed to come to, and
right.
Dr. Fauci has been very, I think he's been as politic as he's able to be, being a New Yorker, and also a guy with, I don't get the sense with him that he's afraid in any way of anyone in the administration, but he was trying to keep his, flow of information open, protect his own scientists, and also maintain his integrity. But there's a limit to how much Dr. Fauci is able to do that because of who he is and his personality. Dr. Birx, on the other hand, she has been very, 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 politic, let's put it that way. Well, there was a big article in the New York Times, I think it was a week and a half ago or so, a couple of weeks ago maybe, that traced what happened in the coronavirus response in the administration during the month of April, and how that came down, where they verged into a whole new strategy of just, let's open up the economy. The virus is done. We're just going to move ahead. And you recall that Trump did a really kind of abrupt pivot twice. The first time he was, this is terrible. We're going to have a bad 2 weeks. And then he said, well, I want to open up on Easter and get the pews open.
Right.
And then he reversed course again. Well, all that was taking place. There was a second task force, a sub-task force that was meeting in Mark Meadows, the chief of staff's office. It was all political hands, and it included Dr. Deborah Birx. And they were meeting sort of on the sly, apparently, or at the very least doing their own thing. And their purpose was to get the economy open as quickly as possible. And Dr. Deborah Birx was giving them the data that they needed to make that case to the main task force, to the president, and then to the public. And it turns out
it reminds me that dynamic is eerily reminiscent of sort of the stovepiping of intelligence leading up to Iraq, right? Where it's like we're going to create an outside sort of entity. I think in the case of the Iraq, it was the Defense Intelligence Agency. I think it was the DIA that is going to basically be our intel shop, and it's going to provide us with the intel so that we'll reverse engineer this. We want it. We want the economy open. Now get us the data that supports that argument.
Exactly. And Dr. Deborah Birx was playing the role in that of George Tenet, the head of the CIA, who was, sort of providing that information to this sub-task force, this sort of second, well, actually it was a third. Jared Kushner had his own task force going as well. In any case, what it turns out to be is that Dr. Deborah Birx has she had an office in the West Wing. She has an office in the West Wing. And she was, as described by the New York Times, very happy to be part of the president's team. And I think we know what that means in Donald Trump's world, right? I mean, this is not about giving him the straight dope. It's about giving him the information that he wants to hear. So she adopted this very optimistic view of the virus and where it was going back in April. She picked the most optimistic model, which was that one that was put out by the University of Washington, and there was a lot of pushback on that from other epidemiologists, even at the time, much less later on when it became obvious that they were wrong. They were the ones predicting 60,000 deaths back in April. She adopted that. She said that this was great, and she was giving reassurance throughout the White House that the virus had hit its peak, that it was not going to come back, at least anytime soon, and gave them what they needed to, go around to the rest of the country, to go before the public and say that, it's time to reopen the economy. Well, we know what the results of that are. And I think that what this says is, that Deborah Birx has, I think she sacrificed her reputation. I don't know whether or not this is just a personality thing. She's some kind of people pleaser, or whether or not it's ideological and she was a true Trump person. But I kind of suspect the latter because of the way she came into the task force and gave that speech at the very beginning and has gone on television giving other dear leader speeches about how his, Trump's history as a businessman has given him a tremendous ability to understand data and complicated, kind of details about epidemiology. I mean, really, really, it's something that you would hear from Kayleigh McEnany. That's who she sounds like, or Kellyanne Conway at times. So, this is just yet another cautionary tale, and it's exactly what you say. It is in line with what they did in Iraq. This is how these Republicans operate. And, here we are again. We didn't do anything about it the last time, right? I mean, nobody paid a price for what they did going into Iraq. And here we are again with this COVID-19 public health crisis, just unprecedented, at least for a century. And we have the same thing happening where these people, and you see it happening in the states too, Ron DeSantis down in Florida, they've been fudging the numbers. You see Deborah Birx now, her latest attempt to skew the data is that they removed the reporting requirements from the CDC and pulled them into a privately run database in Washington. Well, that has, screwed up all the numbers that we have at the moment, and people rebelled, the states did, saying, hey, you can't just pull this on us late, abruptly and not give us any time to prepare. And so it's left to outside, sort of journalistic entities like The Atlantic has this COVID-19 project that tracks all these numbers around the country to try and even give us an idea of where the virus is and what's happening with it. Thank God there are some that are doing that. Johns Hopkins has another one. There are others. But the idea that they removed that from the CDC, that turned out to be Dr. Deborah Birx. So, this is what happens. You put these over and over again. We see it. You put these partisan players into these jobs in which they're supposed to be completely nonpartisan, and this is what happens. And I think there's going to be, and there has to be, some kind of a reckoning on what went on with the response to the crisis. And if there isn't, we've got a big problem. And I'm very concerned that there won't be. If the Democrats have their way. I don't mean to be pessimistic about this, but, history has shown that given the chance to avoid doing something difficult like that, they'll avoid it. And, just this week we saw, apparently Norm Eisen has a book out about the impeachment. He was on the Judiciary Committee staff that was looking at the impeachment. They had a very, complete set of impeachment articles set out, and it was vetoed by the leadership and Nancy Pelosi, and they were forced to just go with that narrow impeachment on the Ukraine stuff when they had a whole list of things,
right,
many of which seemed totally reasonable to me. And the political malpractice there isn't what John Bolton says. It's that if you put out a bunch of articles that of impeachment make the case, you give people an opportunity to pick and choose. Some Republicans, probably not, but you never know, might have been able to do that. Might have said, look, I reject it, kind of what Mitt Romney did. But they didn't do it. They were cowardly.
Well, but it's beyond that. Let's just assume that we can start with the idea on day one that in the context of the impeachment, that none of these things were going to that they weren't going to impeach him on anything. But what it did do, and it certainly was effective in the context of what was going on with Ukraine in terms of the election, right? It shut down an operation that they would have surely been rolling out by now had there not been impeachment. But that's not. But the point is it is members of our government saying to the American public, these things are wrong, right? It's basically just saying, here are the parameters. Whether the Republican Party votes with us or not on this, we're going to make the case that you cannot enrich yourself this way. You can't be involved in this type of corruption. You can't be involved in this type of malfeasance and misfeasance. There's a whole litany of things that he could have been impeached for. And the failure to do so, it would have been Democrats voting exclusively. But it would have been on Republicans to justify why they didn't find these things impeachable, which we lose sight of this. And I think, knock on wood, Donald Trump appears to be headed to a major defeat. But again, we've been down this road before. But to be clear, the numbers that we're seeing, particularly in terms of senators around the country, these numbers were there before COVID. They may not be, COVID may have added a point or two here or there. But the Republicans in the Senate were in big trouble in February and early March before all this COVID hit. Make no mistake about that. And part of it was that they tied themselves to Donald Trump dramatically. Yep. And so there was an efficacy there, but it's also about governance. Going forward, if Joe Biden wins and if the Democrats take the Senate and the House, there needs to be markers, and there needs to be, look, we had John Yoo basically telling the White House, you can do what you want. This is the guy who wrote the torture memos. And went on to Stanford Law, I think it was, or Berkeley. I'm not sure which, forgive me. But, he's a tenured law professor right now. And there are many, many figures like this that we owe it to ourselves in the future to hold these people to account. And the Democrats have utterly failed in that respect. But we're a little far afield of where I wanted
Yeah, sorry about that.
to go. No, but it's an important thing to bring up. And, we have this situation where Burks, is another one of those cronies. And what just astonishes me, is like, how do they think? It's like one thing when some official in the Bush administration told, his name escapes me at the moment, the reporter Ron Suskin, I think it was.
Mm-hmm.
You guys are members of the reality-based community. We make our reality. And I mean, I can see how you can do that in the context of we're gonna put facts on the ground, and we're going to change Iraq. I mean, they did, not necessarily for the better, not necessarily the way that they wanted to, but they were able to pull that off. And certainly, like we see in Israel, we're going to put facts on the ground, and it's going to change the trajectory of things, because we're going to have all these people in land that we're occupying, and then all of a sudden we'll just have so many people there. What are you going to do about it? I mean, that dynamic exists. I don't know how you can be a scientist and think you're going to get away with that with a pandemic, with a virus. I don't understand what their end game was here. You can have all these people come out, but if infections go through the roof and ICUs start filling up, rational human beings are going to say, I think I'm going to skip the nail salon today and for the next couple of months. I think I can probably cut my own hair. I'm not going to go into that bar. I mean, this is, I don't know how out of touch you have to be with humanity to not get this. And that's what we're seeing now. We're also seeing the complete failure of particularly the Republicans in the Senate because Democrats have already passed the HEROES Act, to come up with any type of relief bill for coronavirus. I mean, we need so much help right now. States and cities need so much help. And I just don't know how these Republicans think that by denying states and cities this support, they're going to help themselves. I just don't understand. If you can lie to the general public, why can't you lie to your base and tell them yeah, we're denying cities support, but I don't
Exactly.
do the base even want that? I don't understand this. I mean, this looks like, and I, it's one of those things where it's also a little worrisome. I mean, to me, it looks like they're committing, political suicide, but maybe they know something that I don't know, the American public, they just want us to be really clear that this is not a real thing. I'm not getting it.
I don't either. And I mean, maybe this is just a result of, the sort of degradation of the Republican Party over years again, that now the people who are in office really are dumb. I mean, I don't know how else to put it. I mean, that it's tempting to think that they have a plan, but when you look at the way that they're responding now to the fact that the economy, by the way, which just this week is now showing serious signs of going back to where it was 4 months ago, which is totally logical considering the fact that, as you put it, people are seeing what's going on and they're withdrawing. You're seeing they do these studies based on restaurant reservations and stuff like that, and it's showing that people are staying home again. They're not going out, which was of course what was going to happen. Anybody with a brain could have predicted it. You didn't have to be an epidemiologist to see that once you start bringing in the refrigerated trucks because you don't have room in the morgue anymore, that people are going to look at that and go, maybe this thing really is kind of hurtling out of control. I think I'll just stay home and, make some spaghetti. I mean, this is not this is not something that requires a lot of sophisticated thinking. However, these people seem to really not understand that the only way that they might preserve their own jobs or preserve any kind of credibility in the Republican Party is for the government to step in economically and help all these businesses and try to keep, for instance, they're saying that they refuse to give that $600 extra a week. They don't want to extend these unemployment benefits. Well, that wasn't done just so that people could feel good. That was done because they knew that people were going to spend that $600 in the economy in some way or another, whether it's buying from Amazon or buying more groceries or doing whatever it is that people are spending that money on, maybe even paying off, their debts in some ways. But whatever it was that it was going to keep money circulating at a time when people are staying home. This is just basic, it's not, you don't have to be an economist to know how that works. And they're trying to withdraw that now.
And just to be clear, let me just want to add one thing about that. The sequencing, it's not only are they going to be able to circulate money through the economy, which of course is hugely important, but it's also going to diminish the need to bring people out of their homes. Right. You're paying people to stay at home, and you're paying companies to stay closed in many respects, some of them. And what you're doing is you are attempting to at least, if not defeat the virus, hobble it so badly that after a certain period of time, we can come back out and live a quasi-normal existence until we get that transmissibility rate below, one person gives it to one person, to where it's one person gives it to half a person, essentially, or 3/4 of one, and then it starts to peter out on its own on some level. And I mean, that's the thing, is that like the money's for the economy in the short term, but it's also for the economy in the long term, because it keeps people at home so that in the midterm they can come back out. And
that's what they did in Europe.
That's what they did in Europe.
That's how it's working there.
And to some degree, it's what happened in the Northeast. Yes. Insofar as, but instead of it being money that kept people at home, it was sadly the first place the thing hits, and it was watching thousands of people die, and making people take it seriously, and some measure of relief from the federal government that is again drying up now. And so I don't know how they think that this can happen without paying people to stay at home and paying them enough so that they can actually pay their bills. It's insanity.
How about the political illogic of it? I mean, we're going into an election, right? And here you have their opponents. The Republicans have their opponents, the Democrats, willingly saying, we want to put a bunch of money out there. We want to help people in your states, by the way, in places like Florida, in places like Texas. We want to give them money and make their lives better. And by the way, you'll probably be able to take credit for that if you vote for this, and you may get reelected because of it. It's a gift. It's a political gift that the Democrats are handing them. I mean, if they were as hardcore as Republicans, they'd be sitting there going, hey, let's not do it, and let the Republicans, lose their seats, and then we'll come back and we'll win. I mean, the politics of this, just on a sort of a rank, cynical level, should be that Republicans should be, clamoring for this help for their own cities, for their own states, for their own constituents. But instead, they're saying things like, Rick Scott, the senator from Florida, said Democrats just want to spend money. Okay, but who cares? They want to spend it on your people at a time of great crisis, and they're willing to help you and help your people, your constituents, and you're just sitting there spitting in their faces. It's the most, I think that somehow or another, I've been observing this for many, many years. The Republican Party's been sort of, racing toward the edge of a cliff for a long, long time. But they've finally gone over it. And, as you say, you're wondering, geez, do they know something? What's going on? I just think they're going over the cliff. Unfortunately, they're going to take a lot of people with them. Right. And I don't even know if it's, this is a horrifying prospect that they would sit here. I mean, we've got this unemployment benefits. They're running out. I mean, this is almost over. And if they pull the plug, and they really seem intent upon, basically taking people's incomes and cutting them in half right now.
At least, yes.
If not, if not more. And I just and saying, it's time for you to get back out to work as the pandemic is surging all over the place. And by the way, in places where it isn't surging, you watch, it will be if they force people back out of their houses.
And we're going to see, and speaking of back out of their houses, we're going to see millions upon millions of evictions. I mean, could be tens of millions of evictions take place in the weeks to months at this point. Moratoriums are running out. Eviction moratoriums are running out in certain places, and as people don't have the money. I mean, I sort of feel like this is like one of those weird things where you just come to the end of it, and you use the metaphor of the Republicans driving off a cliff. Well, they've pulled us all there, and I think like they're just hitting the accelerator and jumping right off. For the life of me, I don't see where they anticipate landing, but I guess we'll get a clearer notion of that as weeks go on, and it could just very well be there is no landing for them. Meanwhile, just to pivot a little bit, we have had this ongoing, and this, of course, has been an issue in this country for some time. I mean, and the broader issues have been an issue in this country since its founding, but this movement of Black Lives Matter, in the weeks since, now months, since George Floyd's murder by a police officer, in Portland in particular, but there are other cities around the country, the protests have been ongoing. And the administration decided to use Portland as sort of some type of test case, almost like a pilot program, if you will, on rolling out the unnamed federal police force that was, none of these people were ever designed for this type of like job. They were never trained for it, but also there doesn't seem to be any type of like command structure that we're aware of or accountability for these people. They were renting vans and pulling people off the street and, I guess, what you could call disappearing them for a certain period of time. I wasn't, no one's been obviously like murdered by these police officers in this context. But very disturbing trend. And the Trump administration says, we're going to do this in other cities. So, and of course they're doing it in Democratic controlled cities. Not that it makes it any worse or better, but clearly that they're showing their hand a little bit in terms of it being a political tool. To the extent that it works, I don't know that it will, but it is. You wrote a piece basically calling for the end of the Department of Homeland Security. I remember when this was created in the wake of 9/11, people seem to not be aware that this is, this organization is only 20 years old. And Democrats were against it, if I remember correctly, but largely because of a union issue. People were very cowed at that time, but we're seeing why this entity is so dangerous, right? This idea that like we can create a police force, if you will, from all these disparate agencies that are under the auspices of the Department of Homeland Security. And that seems to be very dangerous. And, I will say this. I'm looking at a book called Ordinary Men right now that is about the implementation of the Holocaust. Now, I know, you're not supposed to cite Hitler and the Nazis when you're talking about this, but I'll just say in terms of like when they were looking for the worst of atrocities to be committed, the military would not do it. And they recruited policemen to do it. And I'm not equating these things, but I am saying that this dynamic is similar, and you cannot, and I am saying that you cannot get to something as horrible as we've seen in the past without going through this stage. That doesn't mean that this stage is going to lead to that, but this is you're working one of those combination locks, and maybe there's a series of 6 things. Well, you got to get through the first one, and they're getting through the first one right now, or maybe it's the second. I don't know, but we're headed down a road here that is highly problematic, and I think it seems to me to be just a function of like Donald Trump think this is going to help his election efforts.
Well, absolutely. Although, I mean, I just setting that aside, Trump thinks this is going to help his reelection efforts. He believes that it's 1962 in America, and the suburbs are all upset. It's white flight, and if you just make the cities look like crazy, riotous places with a bunch of racial minorities, that all his voters will come out and vote for him. I mean, this man is a walking anachronism. That is simply not true. That is not how the suburbs are, and they've done a lot of polling and stuff, but he just believes this. Having said that, there's a whole group of other people who are, sort of involved in this that have a different, obviously have a different motivation. Leading among them is William Barr, the Attorney General, who, when you go back and look at his history, going back to the 80s, he's been very much in favor in any time there's any kind of an uprising of any kind to sending in federal troops. He tried to do it back in the 80s. He had this, he's done an oral history that's really interesting. He did it before any of this happened, in which he remembers, going to George Bush Sr., during the LA riots, and he pushed the idea of sending in first the military. They didn't want to do that. Then he says, well, I can gather a federal force to go in and take over the streets. He was saying that the LA riots were about gang affiliations, which was complete nonsense, in the same way that his current, his current rationale for doing what he's doing is that it's Antifa, that they're a terrorist organization. So he's been doing this for a long time. He, in 1991, when they had the LA riots, he actually chartered an airplane and went around the country and gathered a bunch of federal troops from different cities, from different agencies. We didn't have a Department of Homeland Security then, but we did have Border Patrol, and there were some others that they had. He gathered them all up in an airplane and brought them to L.A. and put them on the streets. I didn't know this until recently, but apparently they were doing that even back then. And of course, Bush did approve of sending in the military to L.A. on the invitation from Governor Wilson at the time, because they were having trouble deploying the National Guard, and it happened with very little. They evoked the Insurrection Act. In any case, Barr has been doing this for a long time. If you go back and look at the phone call that happened on that Monday after, Trump was whisked off to the bunker, quivering in fear because there were protesters in Lafayette Park. That Monday, which we now remember as being the day that they ordered them to violently disperse the protesters in Lafayette Park, he had a phone call. Trump had a phone call with all 50 governors. And that's the one where he said, you have to dominate the streets, right. dominate, you'll look like jerks, et cetera, dominate. Bill Barr was on that call, too. And he said, outright what he planned to do, which was, we are going to send federal troops into the streets to quell these protests and go after these specific ringleaders and arrest them. And, we're going to do all the things that they're doing in Portland. And as we've seen, they are doing this in other cities now. There's a new piece in The Nation by Ken Klippenstein, who's got a lot of great sources apparently in the Department of Homeland Security, that are saying they've been doing this since June, since Barr said they were going to. They've actually been doing this. Now, the Department of Homeland Security is the agency that has taken up this banner. Barr doesn't have direct supervision over the Department of Homeland Security, but the guy who does this guy, Chad Wolf, is a functionary, and he's
Right.
an acting head of department. You know, in other words, he's a Trump flunky. Barr is the one who's running this whole thing, and in fact, he has his own little aspect of this, which is the thing that they sent into Chicago this week, which is federal agents, meaning FBI and others, who are supposedly, quote, helping with crime. Across the country, you have federal agents of one kind or another, whether it's from DHS or whether it's under Barr, under the Department of Justice, going into American cities and making their presence known, whether they're invited there or not. They're going in and basically becoming involved in these, you know, whatever the local issue is, whether it's crime, whether or not it's protests. This is a move on the part of William Barr with Donald Trump's total support because he thinks this is going to help him get reelected. This is exactly what we were afraid of when they made the Department of Homeland Security. I said my mantra at the time was, if they build it, they will use it.
They will use it, yep.
If you build a police apparatus, this is essentially, the Department of Homeland Security is an internal police apparatus. And it is paramilitary. We've seen that with the ICE raids. We've seen it with the way the Border Patrol behaves on the border, what they did with the kids 2 years ago, what they're doing in American cities. This is a paramilitary internal police apparatus. Of course it is. Look what they named it. Department of Homeland Security. It was right. I mean, if there's a more fascistic name for a bureaucratic department, I haven't ever heard it. And the minute that name happened, I think we should have all known. And I did. I'm sure you did too. I was writing about it at the time, going, are you kidding me? We're really going to do this? And it's only belatedly come to, you know, people. I can't remember the name of the guy, but I wrote about it in my piece for Salon. He was one of the deputies, of the early deputies under the Bush administration of the Department of Homeland Security, and he says, gee, you know, there were a lot of people saying that this could happen, and I just thought that was crazy, and we just needed to coordinate to fight terrorism. You know, well, they're looking a little bit more prescient now. Yeah, no
Right.
kidding. You know, I mean, if you know, it says, you point out, if you know anything about history, you know, you don't build institutions that are made for this kind of thing. You just don't. You don't in a free society even create the institution that way in the first place. So Here we are, and I don't think it's going to work for Trump electorally, but I am really nervous that this Department of Homeland Security is now empowered in a way that, again, I'm very nervous that the Democrats are not going to take this on, because if they don't, we have got a real problem here, because, you know, President Tom Cotton, he's already written that he wants to use it. So,
and I hope people have learned the lesson of this dynamic. You can have Barack Obama for 8 years, and I'm sure, you know, I say that with warts and all, as it were. I mean, we're very critical, but in terms of, like, you know, mild-manneredness, my point is that, you know, the idea of going from Barack Obama to Donald Trump seemed pretty far-fetched. I can assure you, the idea of going from Biden or whomever in 2024 to Tom Cotton, that is not nearly as far-fetched, and it is in many respects even more problematic, because the Republican Party is on a trajectory, folks. This is not a function of Donald Trump. Donald Trump is a way station for the Republican Party, and they are in no way any indication that they're moving in any direction other than they've been moving in throughout this Trump administration. And so things are not going to get better unless the Democratic Party, if it's in a position to do so, begins to really sort of, reverse and hold to account what was done during this era. Digby, thank you for being there this week. Like I said at the beginning of this segment, it's been a tough week, and I appreciate your helping me through this segment. And so we will see you again next week, and hopefully next week will be a little bit better for everybody. But Well, we'll
Well,
see.
my pleasure, Sam, and my condolences to you and to your audience and to everybody who knew Michael and followed his work. It's a serious loss for all of us, and I know it had to be particularly painful for you.
Well, thank you, Digby.